All right, here we go. This is the joint House inquiry where Senator Doug Bereuter is interviewing Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage and the Defense Deputy Paul Wolfowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for your initial statements and your responses thus far. Because of a change in the committee's schedule yesterday, I was not able to be here for a part of it that I expected to be, and I want to take a minute or two of my valuable questioning time to say something. And it is that I am concerned about the total preoccupation on intelligence failures. And that's the headlines, of course, and that's what was the theme of all day yesterday and in general. Of course, there are inadequacies and gaps and deficiencies in intelligence collection analysis. We all understand that very well. But what is not being focused upon are the failures in the law enforcement agencies and the other entities that could have averted a terrorist act and are needed to avert future terrorist acts. It is I have been amazed thus far to find that there seems to have been no place in the federal government where there was a responsibility for examining all the potential terrorist scenarios and then taking plans to avoid them with the domestic agencies. I think most citizens would have assumed that capacity existed. I certainly, with some knowledge of the federal structure, would have expected it existed. It apparently didn't. It doesn't take too much imagination, it seems to me, that to imagine that a commercial airliner would be used as a flying bomb. And we know from the committee's report yesterday there were many indications that this was being considered by Al-Qaeda. Tom Clancy had it as a part of one of his books with the airliner being crashed into the Capitol Dome. And if it wasn't specifically assigned to an entity or an interagency group, it looks like it would have been done in the National Security Council. Now we have a Homeland Security Director, and we know where the responsibility is placed and will be developed. Gentlemen, I want to focus first on, I guess, you, Secretary Armitage. I'm generally aware of the recommendations for changes of the intelligence agencies within the Department of Defense. But looking at the State Department's own internal intelligence capacity, the INR, how do you think it interfaces? How has it interfaced, in fact, with the other collectors and analytical capabilities of the federal government? And what changes have been made, or would you contemplate, would you recommend, Secretary Armitage?
The INR, for those who don't know, is the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which is an arm of the National Security Council, the White House, whose primary goals are to promote sourced intelligence, open source intelligence, to support U.S. diplomats in ensuring U.S. foreign policy. It's aimed at ensuring that diplomats and policymakers have access to focused intelligence reports that helps advance U.S. foreign policy. And that's what Armitage and Wolfowitz are relating to. They're related to advancing foreign policy, even though both of the men were responsible for degrading it or abusing the privilege of using foreign policy to for their imperialist ideals. Now, I did a live video the other day about the neoconservative and Israeli Zionists that are dictating U.S. foreign policy. And that was a pretty good video, I must say. It was about an hour and 25 minutes to explain, foreign policy goals and missions of the late 80s, early 90s, and the help of the growth of the neoconservatives or the revisionist neoconservatives who arose out of the Leo Strauss School, which shaped American foreign policy with 9/11 as the pretext to extrapolate on the goals like the Wolfowitz Doctrine or the Project for New American Century and the Yoden Plan to an extent, which are being carried out right now to the current day. And so Bereuter is asking whether the INR had the necessary capabilities and analysts to transcribe the data that they were receiving.
Thank you. In INR, we are primarily and almost exclusively involved in analysis and not in gleaning intelligence. And I believe your own excellent staff of this committee has determined that much of the analysis in INR was pretty damn good. Number one. Number two, that means that primarily it's limited by the information in. So one might contemplate whether the state itself wants to have a larger, sort of more active role in the gleaning of intelligence. Now, primarily the intelligence we get is open source or for comments of one embassy officer with some host country official or another. And the other is gleaned from open sources, and Paul was careful and I think right to draw our attention to that. We have put both INR and DS, diplomatic security agents.
Now, let me give you some background. Armitage and Wolfowitz are the primary forces behind the Iraq War years before the September 11th attacks. So they just used 9/11 as the pretext to fight against, to justify the U.S. military invasion of the country. Armitage and Paul Wolfowitz wrote a letter to then President Clinton regarding, and there was other leading neoconservatives like Douglas Feith, Richard Pearl, the rest of the ghouls, where they pressured the Clinton administration. And when I mean pressure, I mean pressure. These guys don't work as part of the White House, right? Paul Wolfowitz was the undersecretary of defense, and later on, he and Douglas Feith opened up a unit in the Pentagon called the Office of Special Plans, and it wasn't open to everybody in the federal government. It was just a select group of people, and these people are so powerful that they can pressure a sitting president regarding a foreign policy decision, such as using the military to justify an invasion to force the overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
With the Counterterrorism Center. This is good at breaking down the culture. It also helps us a bit. We have had before 9/11 and continue now to have FBI officers who serve in our Counterterrorism Center. So I think in the main, I've got to do a little more with the budget for INR because, as I said, we've now got 10 analysts strictly devoted to terrorism, which is up from before, but it's clearly not sufficient. But the analysis they've given was, I think, judged by your own commissioners to be pretty much on the mark.
He was part of a group called the Vulcans. I spoke about this too in the live video. It's like this group of people, like Condoleezza Rice and Richard Armitage, Paul Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, where these are foreign policy analysts, and they were basically outlining a plan to invade Iraq, and they tried to do it under Clinton. Clinton wouldn't budge, and you know what happened to Clinton, right? The Monica Lewinsky scandal. And there's some rumor that the Israeli intelligence was bugging the White House or his phones, and thus, really probably were the driving factors in getting rid of Clinton, in which Bush became president in 2001 after the election, which saw him barely defeat Al Gore. And there's some suspicion around that as well. But yeah, these guys like Armitage and Wolfowitz, these are the real villains, man. I mean, you want to talk about Al Qaeda as a terrorist organization, yeah, these guys would be real terrorists.
Sir.
Thank you. Secretary Wolfowitz, you generally quote the president in the conclusions of your testimony this morning as saying that every element of national power must be used against the terrorist, military, law enforcement, diplomatic, intelligence And I don't think anyone would dispute that. Looking back at the small boat attack on the
Actually, just to add too about Armitage, shortly after 9/11, he traveled to Pakistan and met with President Musharraf, um, and basically said to him, you can either have a carpet of gold or a carpet of bombs in their assistance in fighting against Al Qaeda in Pakistan. What they real Al Qaeda and the Taliban. What Armitage was really wanting was to use Pakistan as a launching pad to fight against the Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. Pakistan agreed.
USS Cole in the previous administration, but looking back at it and determining what was done at that point or what was not done, why well, first of all, was there a military response
No.
planned to respond to the attack on the USS Cole? And if not, why not?
This is a great question, right? Why didn't we? Maybe it's because the Yemeni government, as well as U.S. Ambassador to Yemen, Barbara Bodine, basically shut off the FBI from investigating the matter because she hated John O'Neill, who was the lead federal investigator on the Cole, because of his domineering attitude. She didn't like him and kicked him out. And Yemen, by the way, is a haven for Al Qaeda. One of the largest units of Al Qaeda outside of Afghanistan was in Yemen.
Was there an expectation that the problems of Al Qaeda and the Taliban would be handled by the intelligence agencies or covert operations? Why was there no attack? And was there any military planning to respond to the USS Cole attack?
Congressman, I can't tell you what happened in the immediate aftermath of the attack. I can tell you that 6 months later, when we came into office, or when Secretary Armitage and I came into office, it was clear that terrorism had to be dealt with in a different way. It's not a law enforcement problem, and it can't be dealt with simply by retaliating against individual acts of terrorism. As we said earlier, we understood that this was an entity that was at war with us, and that taking them on involved something more than just an individual retaliatory response. That wasn't going to stop the problem. You, I think, expressed your puzzlement, and undoubtedly the puzzlement of many Americans, at why the FBI didn't provide some of this information. In fairness to the FBI, it ought to be pointed out that for very good, substantial reasons, they are not supposed to report information on Americans to intelligence agencies. This is an issue we've got to confront now, but they weren't, it's not that they were stupid. They're there under a different set of rules that require people to be very careful about information that can be prosecuted. But if I could, just 2 points. We're not going to win this war on defense, no matter how good our intelligence is. We've got to go on offense, and offense does not just mean a one-off military retaliation. It means the kind of campaign that we're conducting now against terror.
See, but bin Laden wanted a response. You know, something that the legendary Scott Horton elucidated in his book, Time to End the Wars, that bin Laden was waiting to go, he was trying to goad the United States into invading Afghanistan, right? So, because bin Laden was in Afghanistan. And he thought that the embassy bombings would do it. He really did. But Clinton wouldn't budge. So he said, let's attack a U.S. military installation. And it was going to be in the Millennium Plot, where part of the plot was which is a multi-phase plot facilitated by numerous groups. One of them was Al Qaeda, the driving force. And one of them was to bomb the USS Sullivans in Yemen. But the boat that was carrying the bombs there was too much weight of the bombs, and the boat sunk the little boat to the I think it was a plexiglass boat or something like that, and it sunk to the bottom and failed. And then the USS Cole bombing took place on October of 2000. And bin Laden, to his surprise, was not met with any military retaliatory strikes. And when Bush became president, he then upped the ante. And then came the planes operation. That's September 11, 2001. And that was the first terrorist attack under the Bush administration. And it worked. Bush, military invaded Afghanistan. And to bin Laden's probably delight, they also invaded Iraq, something that he was not counting on. In the hopes of that the United States would overextend its military arm, its military might, as well as putting the country in a deficit. And with just Afghanistan, we spent $3 trillion over the course of 20 years, which was the longest war in U.S. history. And it failed completely. It was a failure because as we left the country in August of 2021, the Taliban took over overnight.
It means a war.
Secretary Wolfowitz, we're well aware of the limitations properly imposed upon the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but there is no excuse whatsoever for the failure to communicate what the agents in the Phoenix office had uncovered, which therefore caused a failure to respond properly to the agents in the Minneapolis field office.
Yeah.
There's an absolute failure in that bureaucracy and a information technology failure, to say the least. And so it's important we don't divert by telling us that this is not in their area of responsibility from their real failures in this instance. And of course, yesterday, the family witnesses pointed out to us about the 11 minutes or perhaps 12 minutes that seemed to have taken place in FAA control New York after they knew that the second airliner was headed for the second tower, but no alert was given to the Port Authority. I would like Secretary Armitage, if you...
Yeah, failures on numerous levels, right? The FAA for allowing, not having enough personnel on duty to respond immediately and to warn the World Trade Center, the Port Authority, which Bereuter, I'm glad he raised this issue because it's an issue that's hardly ever raised, as well as the bureaucracy within the FBI. It's not just a CIA, NSA problem. The FBI at the highest levels failed their own agents. And I've interviewed some, Ken Williams, Phoenix, Mark Rossini in New York, and on loan to Alex Station, and also Harry Sabin in Minneapolis and Colleen Rowley from the Radical Fundamentalist Unit for now approving the application for a FISA warrant to investigate Zacchaeus Moussaoui, the alleged 20th hijacker, and his personal belongings until the day after 9/11.
Who would respond to this question?
And Stephen Butler, who was handling an informant in San Diego regarding this informant living with two al-Qaeda operatives who happened to be Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. I did a video about this, a live video about this. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many FBI whistleblowers. And of course, Robert Wright Jr. from Chicago, who tried to blow the whistle years prior about terrorist operative cells inside the United States and their links to al-Qaeda and Hamas. And he was basically thrown under the bus, the poor guy.
Do you feel that U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East...
Not everybody in the FBI is in on it. And I know, I hear this from, the fringe elements of the truth movement, 9/11 truth movement. Oh, we can't trust the FBI. Meanwhile, more whistleblowers came out of the FBI than any other agency on the earth regarding 9/11.
Contributed to the rise of al-Qaeda?
No, Senator.
Oh, wow. Let me play this back right away so you can hear. This is the big one here.
Respond to this question. Do you feel that U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has contributed to the rise of al-Qaeda?
No, Senator.
Meanwhile, bin Laden has stated even in the mid-90s during interviews with Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera, Arabic publications in the Sudan, in Britain, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, where he basically says that United States foreign policy is the reason why he's conducting these terrorist attacks. They don't hate us for our freedoms. They don't care what women wear here. It's because of our policy, our one-sided foreign policy with Israel and Saudi Arabia. And no, it's not anti-Semitic to say that, because bin Laden is actually saying it. And I'm not giving bin Laden a pass. I know he's a murderer and he's a terrorist and he's irredeemable. But sometimes you have to listen from your enemy as to why they're enacting violence upon you, so you can make the necessary corrections. These people don't want that. They precipitate the violence with their horrific foreign policy and sanctions on countries like Iraq in the first Gulf War, like Yemen currently now, in Iran currently now.
I would say to you that many people believe that it does.
Yeah.
And many people in the Middle East, more importantly, believe that it does.
That's a different question.
And then,
What's
in
that?
light of this attitude of so many people living in the Middle East, and indeed some of our citizens, what is the State Department's role to correct errors in perception, I guess we'll put it
None.
that way, or to change their attitude about the United States and their attitude about the terrorists?
Well, that would mean that we would have to shatter the CIA and scatter into 1,000 winds, demonetize the Pentagon and its growing bloated budget, get rid of the private military corporatists, slash the funding from Boeing, Raytheon, LG3 Technologies, Halliburton, and the rest of the private industrialists.
So you understand this?
And the banking industry, who give out these egregious loans to some of these CEOs and corporate lackeys involving the military industrial complex and private military firms. Yeah, we got a lot of work to do there. And say, of course, the intelligence community headed under the Five Eyes, which is the countries that are have the largest intelligence services, including regarding signals intelligence: Canada, Great Britain, United States, Australia, New Zealand, and 30 other countries now.
Explicitly, but I want to make the point that Osama bin Laden was planning these attacks at a time when the Israeli-Palestinian question was in a much more benign state, when our president was meeting here at Camp David, and they're very close to a resolution. So I do not.
That's not the only reason, Mr. Armitage, and I think you noticed because you're not stupid. Basically, he even asserts that the reason why he's attacking the United States is because we have military installations in Mecca and Medina, considered the holiest site in all of Islam, in Saudi Arabia, as well as the sanctions, which led to over 500,000 deaths in Iraq in 1990 for the oil for food program.
Not by the argument that our policy in the Middle East is responsible for al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. And it was only laterally, it was only after these World Trade Center attacks that Osama bin Laden could even say the word Palestinian out loud publicly. Now, the question of what should we do to fix it, I think we are trying to work a very difficult equation to address a humanitarian situation, particularly with in the occupied territories, to work with our closest ally.
By the way, this interview took place on September 19, 2002, and nothing, no progress was made regarding the occupied territories in Israel. In fact, it's gotten worse. As of today, Israel basically bombed some installation. I forgot where. And it was like a aerial bombing, a huge bombing too. And they're bombing Shiite militias in Syria who are fighting against the terrorists, that war on terror that we had after the 9/11 attacks. Well, yeah, Israel and the United States are basically protecting the jihadists in Syria. Meanwhile, Iranian militias led by the Revolutionary Guard, as well as the army, who are helping the Assad government trying to take over the country from these jihadist factions, Saudi-backed, Gulf-backed, supported by Israel and the United States. And the countries who did support it, like Jordan, now are thinking twice because, the jihadists have basically lost the battle.
The government of Israel, who even today suffered yet again from terrorism, and finally to have a political change in the Palestinian Authority that will allow the Palestinians to be governed by the type of government people deserve. And that's all.
They do. And in fact, every government, any type of government that the Palestinians have, Israel and the United States would just label them terrorists. And so they don't have a standing army. The only defense group that they have is the Hamas and the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Palestinian Jihad. The small Palestinian Jihad and Hamas are terrorist organizations. They're led by the jihadist principles of Wahhabism, but PLO is not. And you labeled the PLO terrorist years ago. And that's the reason why Israel helped to facilitate Hamas in 1985 to help repel the PLO. So yeah, Israel would be responsible for it.
All ongoing, and that was the subject of Secretary Powell's meeting yesterday in New York, 2 days ago, with the quartet.
Secretary Armitage, would you speak to the role of the public diplomacy that would have an impact upon attitudes of the population of the Middle East, particularly the Arab countries?
Yeah, this is an area, and we've done historically, we know now, a bad job. The Secretary brought in Charlotte Beers to try to really address this, and I'm delighted that particularly Frank Wolf's Appropriations Committee in the first instance has been so supportive to give us the resources for this. But we had to learn what the questions to ask were before we could start addressing them, and I think Charlotte Beers has done that, and we're off and running in the Middle East. And I think over time, you'll be able to judge whether we've been effective or not. I don't think I can judge that today.
It's an important priority. We wish you well in this respect, and much success.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask both of you if you would give us your own observations about the weaknesses that you have observed with regard to intelligence collection and analysis. And let me just stipulate, we all seem to agree that there's an inadequacy of human intelligence and a risk aversion perhaps in some of the people involved in human, which we're trying to address. But setting that aside, what other kinds of weaknesses have you seen in your experience in government, going back over some years now and continuing to this day, in the intelligence collection analysis function of the federal government? And of course, I'm talking about foreign intelligence collection.
I think that the questions of human intelligence and agents and all of that, this committee, both the House and the Senate, have delved into it at great length. But a point that's always bothered me was alluded to by Paul, and that is that in the intelligence community, in the analysis business, which is where I am, I'm the consumer, it's very rare that we get the one-off voice or the dissident voice that Paul was talking about. For a policymaker, a dissonant voice is very helpful either to confirm what you're already thinking or to really open up a new area, and this is not generally done. And if I had to say the one biggest weakness in the analysis area, I would say that's it. Second, it's the way analysis in the intelligence community is generally put forward, and it's related, and that is consensus.
We found, for example, a dissident voice in the DIA that seemed to be discouraged from being able to present his viewpoints. And I would guess that's a common problem. So
that would be Anthony Schaefer, who was part of a very covert operation led by the Department of the Army, codename Able Danger, in which they, along with the Land Information Warfare's Activities Division and members of Schaefer's unit called Stratus Ivy, which basically collected data, open source data, as well as classified data. And with that data, they found out that there was terrorist groups operating inside the United States, in which they made a chart, which was created by Orion Scientific. And in the chart was, the face of bin Laden and the connections he had all over the world, inside the United States as well. And the chart was huge, and nobody had any clue. I think the CIA had a clue, but they don't care. They don't tell nobody nothing. The chart was tremendous. It showed all these connections in Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, and inside the United States, as well as having connections inside countries like Germany, France, Algeria, what have you, right? And so he tried to pass this information to the FBI. He was not allowed to, and they were ordered to destroy the data because they were collecting data on members of the Hamburg cell who were responsible for piloting Americans 11 and 175 and 93 allegedly. And because they were classified as U.S. persons by the Department of Defense, they ordered the information destroyed. Meanwhile, it came out later through a Senate Select Intelligence Committee hearing that a member of the Department of Defense, William Dugan, testified that no, Mohammed Atta would not be classified as a U.S. person. The data shouldn't have been destroyed, in other words. Now, if that data would have been shared with the FBI or with the State Department, that's one area where they could have prevented a part of 9/11, maybe all of 9/11. Sounds familiar? That's exactly what happened with the CIA when they didn't allow the FBI to share information gleaned from the CIA regarding two Al-Qaeda members, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, who had dual U.S. visas, that they were coming to the United States. And they withheld that information from the FBI for 16 months. The NSA, they had their own program monitoring the phone lines of bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda communications hub in Yemen. Did they share that with the FBI or the NSA, the CIA or the State Department? No, nobody shared nothing.
You bring up an interesting point, and how do we protect that? How do we make sure that those dissident voices that sometimes have part of the answer or the answer are heard?
I must say, I remember when Director Gates was the deputy director, I remember vividly, I was in the Pentagon, he sent down something on Africa, and it had to do with the community view on AIDS, HIV/AIDS in Africa. And he said, I want to give you the view of one analyst. It is not a community product, which was dramatically different, and by the way, dramatically correct, as we've seen by the virulence of the spread of AIDS. And that's the kind of thing that just has to be encouraged.
Secretary Wolfowitz, would you like to focus in on your observations and any weaknesses other than the HUMINT, which we could probably agree on?
I really would just reinforce this observation about the need to get alternative views up, because almost everything that's important here is shrouded in ambiguity and uncertainty. There's nothing that's flat, black and white. And there is, I think, a tendency to want to get things scrubbed out, to get the differences eliminated. I remember the first national intelligence estimate I ever read, which I'm embarrassed to say was nearly 30 years ago, in which it was on the critical issue of Soviet strategic capabilities. And I believe it was the Director of Central Intelligence, in forwarding the report, said very proudly what a great job these people had done in producing a report on such an important subject without a single footnote, in other words, without a single voice of disagreement. And I was just appalled. I mean, I thought, how can you possibly address a subject of that importance without differences? So I think get those differences up on the table, get the raw information up a little bit faster. Understandably, some of it's going to be wrong, and you don't want people rushing off and taking precipitous actions based on raw intelligence. But I think there's a tendency to hoard stuff too long and to keep it in compartments.
Thank you.
Yeah, and they know this. Look, come on, man. It's no secret, and especially with 9/11, it's such a big operation. And, with the director of the CIA, the George Tenet, basically in December of 1998, where he says he was at war with Al-Qaeda, that the agency was at war with Al-Qaeda. And that was adjudicated to the State Department and members of the National Security Council and the Pentagon. Everyone knew. And all these agencies were concentrating now on this Al-Qaeda group led by Osama bin Laden. And all of a sudden, over the next 2 or 3 years, all these agencies basically you'd think would be on the same side, sharing intelligence with one another, trying to protect the country if they really believe that crap. And they don't. They protect their own interests. And if you haven't gotten that by now, you are living in la la land. I don't know what will. I mean, look, they intentionally withheld information from the FBI, the federal arm of the United States, domestic. What are these agencies good for? They're there for the protection of American citizens, allegedly. Well, they're not. These agencies don't care. They're responsible for some of the worst atrocities on the face of the earth. These people are sociopaths. A lot of them are, not everybody. The bureaucrats certainly are. Oof.
I want to ask both of you, are there any groups any groups other than Al-Qaeda, capable of or seriously considering attacking the United States
No.
today? And I'm talking about the homeland.
I think in terms of capability and virulence, Hezbollah certainly is capable. They have
No, they are not. I mean, you're such a liar. And these neocons, they adhere to Zionist principles of Israel, and they, they're interlinked together, inseparable. Neocons, American Zionists, Jewish Zionists, and dual Israeli citizenships inside the United States and Israel, and they work in the federal government. These people don't have any loyalty. They just don't, not to any one agency. They are loyal to their own interests. That is basically it. And they hope for terrorist attacks. These people allowed 9/11 to happen. I can make a great argument that they did, especially the CIA. I mean, I could probably give them complete foreknowledge. And the NSA too. I can make a great argument with them. But yeah, Hezbollah, they're Lebanon's military arm. No, they're not an international terrorist organization. You, however, the Pentagon, you at the White House, you're the terrorist because you have the military might and the capabilities to conduct terrorist attacks, and you still do. How many people have you killed around the world?
thus far confined themselves to.
And these two men right here, sitting right here, Armitage and Wolfowitz, they're responsible for regurgitating the CIA and Israeli fictitious reports regarding Iraq and procuring chemical and biological weapons, where we, killed 1 million or 1.5 million people. 1 million. 3,000 died on 9/11. 1 million died in Iraq. Who do you think the terrorists are? Al-Qaeda or the members of the neoconservatives, the State Department, the military Pentagon arm, the private military industrialists, the foreign lobbyists?
Remain to Central and South America and, of course, the Middle East. But capability, they could do it.
Liars.
It's absolutely right, and intentions are one of those.
Of course, you would agree, you muppet, because you are trying to label Hezbollah as equal to Al Qaeda. Meanwhile, they're two separate they have different ideological backgrounds. Shia majority is Hezbollah. They're not an international terrorist organization. They're labeled terrorists by Israel and the United States and the coalition partners. And of course they would, because Israel considers them a terrorist, and so does Saudi Arabia. That's the reason why they're attacking Yemen with American-grade weapons.
Things that if you want any precision on, you'll almost never get it.
That's why, that's why Israel continues to conduct operations in Syria, because Lebanon considers Syria a strong ally, and have been for decades. And that's the reason why. We go to war with these countries that can't protect themselves, and they're never Sunni countries. They're always Shia countries. Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Iran.
Reject the evidence that comes from overt expressions of hostility, then you'll be taken by surprise every time.
Is there any other entity you would suggest other than Hezbollah at this point?
Hamas?
Or make general reference to, if you don't wish
No,
to.
other than to make the obvious point that there are a number of groups in the so-called network, that is Al-Qaeda, whose intentions are clearly to harm Americans. They've said it, they do it, they write it, whether it's Jamiat Islama or any others. So I don't have direct information that they're targeting the United States, but they're certainly intent on targeting U.S. interests.
Well, I do have to bring up Abu Sayyaf and Jamiat Islamiyah, and they conducted the second worst terrorist attack, and nobody ever talks about it. And it actually involved the Bali bombings of 2002, where members of Jamiat Islamiyah were responsible for the bombing of the Sari Club and Paddy's Bar, which killed, I think, 250 people or something like that. Most of them were Australians who were tourists, but the guilty parties that were behind the operation were partly funded by its co-leader Ridwan Samudin, who goes by the Nam de Gwar Hambali, a notable lawmaker who has connections with Al Qaeda. And these people are led by a notable theologian and Wahhabist jurisprudence scholar. I'm drawing a blank. Bashir. What was his name? No, Omar Bashir is in the Sudan. Oh man, it's this teacher he just got released for his participation in advocating for terrorist bombings on the main islands of Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And I can't remember his name right now. Forgive me. But yeah, I mean, these guys have connections to Al Qaeda, but they don't have like the international means to conduct terrorist operations inside the United States. So there's no threat. Are they a threat to interests? Sure. But again, you're missing the point, because these people are basically doing it in response to U.S. foreign policy, which you won't acknowledge.
Congressman, we don't have that kind of precise information about what groups are there.
Yes, you do. Paul, I swear, God, you're such a bastard, right? These reports came in for years about Abu Sayyaf and Jemaah Islamiyah and, Al Qaeda and, God's sakes, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Gamma Islamiyah in Egypt, and give me a break. The warnings were there. Like Bereuter said earlier in the video, where that it was noted throughout FBI reports going back, the mid '90s, where the interest was to hijack planes and crash them into American sensitive targets. Yeah, I've mentioned this dozens of times regarding the Pachinko plot, which was, multi-phase plot involving a second part of the plot, which was to hide sleeper cells inside the United States, whose mission was to hijack planes and crash them into targets, which led to the Phoenix memo by Ken Williams, which he mentions early in this video. And God's sakes, the warnings were there. It's not like the warnings weren't there. It's not like the intelligence wasn't there. No, that's another misnomer by the Truth Movement, 9/11 Truth Movement. It's that it's worse. The intelligence was there. They had the capabilities. And, you get these poor schleps like Armitage and Wolfowitz, and later on, members of the intelligence community like Cofer Black of the Counterterrorism Center of the CIA, and later George Tenet, the director of the CIA, Robert Mueller, the FBI, the director, all crying poor. We need a bigger budget. We need bigger this. And all the intelligence bureaucrats always cry to these Senate appropriations committees about wanting a bigger budget. That's all they do. And when 9/11 happened, woo-wee, according to former senior executive Thomas Drake, one of the NSA's top directors was Barbara McGinsky. I think I'm saying her name right. In which she said that we can milk 9/11 for years like a cow. And what she was hoping for was a blank check for the NSA, and they got it. Hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, the White House, the Bush White House, basically wanted to talk with Director Michael Hayden about accessing what they needed to access signals intelligence regarding terrorists inside the United States. Terrorist was a vague definition then. And he said that we needed to enter the dark side, and they did. And they allowed the NSA to conduct warrantless, keyword, warrantless wiretappings of Americans, which began in 2003. And in 2006, it was released by leaks inside the White House that the NSA was conducting these wiretaps. I did a video about Mark Klein, who's an AT&T technician who blew the whistle about the NSA having a room in San Francisco called 641A, which was a secret room that he had no access to. No access to this room, which was basically a splitting room, which was accessing Americans' emails, text messages, and phone calls.
Group that calls itself the Islamic Movement for Change, that sent a threatening letter to our embassy in Saudi Arabia in the spring of 1995 and then claimed credit for the attack in Riyadh in the fall of 1995, has never been identified. We don't know what.
Yeah, you know who you blamed. I'm glad you brought this up. You blamed Shiite militia groups, Hezbollah, Iran, Iraq for those bombings. Meanwhile, when the FBI went to investigate the Khobar Tower bombings, for example, in 1995, the Saudis basically interfered in the investigation. And they got this poor group of people to take blame, but probably tortured the living crap out of them. And they hung them right away and said the investigation's over. Meanwhile, the NSA heard wiretaps between Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the second in command of Al-Qaeda, now the emir, and who is the co-leader of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, basically congratulating somebody on the other line for the attacks. Who was on the other line? Osama bin Laden.
Countries or what groups have sleeper cells buried around the world now. We know what people have capabilities.
And because Louis Freeh, who was the FBI director at the time, because he's close friends with the head of the General Intelligence Directorate of the Saudi Arabian security arm, Prince Turki bin Faisal, he basically said, all right, let's go home. No more investigation. We're pulling it. No, don't go into a deep investigation. So when the FBI Attorney General Inspector report came out, it was basically like, we got no help from the Saudis. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, they got plenty of help.
Know what people have declared hostile intentions toward us. And as I go back to Secretary Rumsfeld's point, those are the dots. And if you want to wait until they're connected, you're going to wait until something terrible happens.
Both of you have experience beyond your current capacity and previous roles in the administrations. Both of you have held important roles in the Department of Defense, and one continues today, of course. What do you think the state of affairs is with respect to our allies and their ability to provide intelligence to us? Is there progress yet to be made in that respect?
Well, first of all, the difference between September 10th and September 12th in this regard is night and day. And that includes more than just intelligence. It's also in the terrorist financing. We stood up the terrorist financing back in May, the tracking center. But after the tragedy, people came aboard. Is there more work to be done? Absolutely. And I say that with complete assurance because we don't know what we don't know from these countries. And we sometimes find it very surprising that we have some information which turns out to be true. And we take it to host countries and they say, oh, yeah, well, we knew about that. We neglected to tell you. We forgot to tell you. So there's a lot of work still to be done.
I just add very briefly, our cooperation with our allies improved dramatically after September 11th. Our cooperation with unfriendly countries improved dramatically after the fall of the Taliban.
That's funny. In the summer of 2001, for example, France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Russia, the Philippines, Indonesia, all gave intelligence reports about bin Laden preparing to attack the United States. And of course, the infamous August Presidential Daily Brief, August 6 PDB, it's called Bin Laden Determined to Strike Inside the United States. That's the headline, right? That was the CIA's gleaming and interviews of, or interrogation of Ahmed Bassam, who is one of the people involved with the Millennium bombing plot, in which he was supposed to drive a car near Los Angeles International Airport, packed with explosives, and blow it up. And when he was interviewed by the FBI, he basically, a lot of that information went into that report. Again, often misunderstood. Oh, we didn't have the intelligence because they hid it. Yeah, they hid a lot of it, but there was a lot out there about the United States, which is going to be susceptible to an attack very soon. Did the White House, did the FBI bureaucrats, did the National Security Council warn the Federal Aviation Administration, Immigration Naturalization Services, local law enforcement to begin stricter policies, especially the FAA and INS. Enforce stricter policies about Arabs coming from terrorist sympathizing countries like Afghanistan, like the Sudan, like Yemen. No. And the reason why the FBI didn't do this was because, according to many of the FBI whistleblowers, FBI bureaucrats like Free and later Mueller basically said that members of the State Department of State and the Department of Justice, they basically didn't want to offend the kingdom. They didn't want to offend Arabs by enforcing stricter security measures. And that's it. And that's the end of the video. So, yeah, I mean, look, these two men are responsible for some of the worst atrocities that ever happened in the Middle East. They're responsible for the neoconservative outlines like the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the Bush Doctrine, the Project for New American Century. And these people have no loyalty to the United States. Their loyalty is to their own interests, like Israel, Saudi Arabia, private industrialists of the Pentagon, of sympathizers within the kingdom, and billions and billions and billions are at stake. And these people just don't care about the safety and security of the United States or its citizens. And I don't know what you need to understand that, because if 9/11 doesn't do that for you, I don't know what will.